no comment about.
Thank you all so much for being here. I am really excited to talk about this chapter. When Philip told me that I could pick something, he said, well, you pick one of, like, there's some that, people might have picked already, and I knew immediately which one I wanted, and I was both pleased and shocked that nobody had chosen it, because it's obviously the best fucking chapter. Chapter 10. So what I'm going to do is, I really wasn't sure exactly how to prepare for this, and I wasn't sure what kind of audience I would have. I worry, knowing enough of the people in the audience, that this is going to be sort of Marx-splaining to people who don't need it. So hopefully what we can do is, I'm just going to give some sort of introduction into the chapter that sort of really illuminates some of what I love about the chapter, and then hopefully we can sort of have a bit of a broader conversation about it. I have a friend who ran sort of anarchist reading groups in Milwaukee when I lived there, and his joke was that this is the fun chapter to talk about in reading groups, because it's when everybody just gets to bitch about their jobs, which is true. And I'm actually some of what I'm going to say at the beginning sort of speaks to that and why that is a little bit. So I'm not super great at being spontaneous, so I do have this written out, but I'm going to try to sort of do it in a seemingly spontaneous way. And if you have like a thought, just say it. So this is not a lecture, it's a opening. So if you haven't read Capital in a while, it's worth remembering that. Or ever. It's worth knowing that chapter 10 actually marks a kind of transitional point in the book. And one of the things that happens is that the first half of the volume is working through the sort of very basic kernel of Marx's idea that labor power as sort of human potential and human creativity is the secret of capitalism, is essentially the source of value. So if you think about the famous chapter on the commodity fetish, that's sort of the lesson of that chapter, right? Which is that, like, we have these sort of commodity objects that seem to be walking around and talking to us and seducing us in various ways. And in fact, the source of their sort of uncanny animation is actually labor power. It's the sort of obscured content that allows them to move as if they're possessed, essentially, and it makes them so appealing to us as well. But those first chapters tend to be sweeping. They tend to be not particularly historical. They tend to be a bit abstract. They're brilliant chapters, right? They're brilliant, but they did tend to be in that sort of vein. And what happens beginning from chapter 10 really through the end of the book, I mean, chapter 10 begins on around 340. So really from around 340 to the last 500 pages of the book, there's a little bit of a shift. And I think, so what the next few chapters take up, right, is they take up factory work. That's the chapter on the working day, so it's very historically specific. They take up cooperation. They take up the division of labor, specifically the way the division of labor works. They take up machinery. And then towards the end, these sort of brilliant, famous chapters on what Marx calls so-called primitive accumulation, which is like, where does capital begin? What is the secret of the origin of capital? Well, it's essentially in the theft of land by way of the institution of private property. So that's sort of the interesting thing about the book is that the organization of the book seems to be somewhat backward, right? Because it actually ends with origins, right? Which is, I think, a super compelling aspect of its sort of structure. But a lot of that sort of shift to the historical and the concrete happens with chapter 10. And so, and as a result, beginning from chapter 10, you really start to see the class struggle, as opposed to capitalism as a sort of abstract structural force. You begin to see the sort of importance of class struggle to the formation of capitalism and also the sort of seeds of resistance to it. So famously, Marx was once asked by a friend and supporter of his, this guy, Dr. Kugelman, who was a member of the Communist League, but he was also a doctor and fairly wealthy. And he loaned Marx money a lot, including he loaned him the money that enabled him to publish the first German edition of Capital. So Dr. Kugelman asks Marx in a letter, what chapter, my wife Gertrude wants to read Capital, but she doesn't know where to begin. Where should my wife begin? And Marx says that she should begin with chapter 10, that she should begin with the working day chapter. And the funny thing is that when I talk to students, undergrad students and grad students who have never read the book, and they sort of seem freaked out by it, I sort of say, maybe you should begin with chapter 10. Because in a way, I think, particularly if what you want to get out of the book first is something that speaks to you in terms of the sort of experiential, that it's actually quite a good place to start. So I often tell students that they should read it out of order. Sometimes I tell them start with primitive accumulation, start with the very last 3 chapters, and then go back. Because I actually think the stuff on the commodity makes a lot more sense after you've read the stuff at the end. I think you're better poised to understand the earlier abstract chapters on the commodity and on value if you've read the sort of later, more concrete, more experiential, more historically grounded chapters. It's also worth noting, partly because a little bit of the sort of the theme of the way that I want to talk about this chapter has to do with reading it a bit through interventions by way of Marxist feminism. It's worth noting that Marx eventually ended his friendship with Dr. Kugelman, in part because he loathed away. This is from a letter that Marx wrote to his wife Eleanor. Although a sincere believer in the ultimate triumph of socialism, he treated his wife, quote, who is in all respects his superior, quite poorly. Eleanor, Marx's wife, agreed, and she wrote back to him, "It is a hard thing when a woman has no money of her own." So I think in a way, in the exchange between Karl and Eleanor Marx, you can already see the importance of grounding critique and politics in everyday experience. And so I think it's kind of interesting that this is the chapter that Marx recommends to this woman he later sort of ends this friendship with the woman's husband because of the sort of sense of the husband's failure to see his wife for the free subject that she was. But the most interesting thing is that this chapter almost wasn't in the book at all. So, as you might know, the first edition of Capital Volume 1 is the German edition published in 1867. And basically, as soon as Marx publishes it, a French publisher reaches out and says, I want to publish a French edition, I want to publish a translation, and Marx says, no, I want you to wait because I want to make changes. Like, he already had in mind a lot of changes that he wanted to make to it. And so the French edition was published serially, which is sort of interesting, between 1872 and 1875. So a solid 5 years after the first German edition. And it is the last edition that was fully edited and published by Marx himself, because Marx died in 1883 before the publication of the second German edition. So the French version of the text is sort of considered to be the one that is like most Marx's version, because the third German edition was ultimately edited by Engels. The changes that are made in the French edition are taken by a lot of scholars to be decisive, and one of the people that has written most beautifully about the effect of those changes is the Marxist feminist existentialist Raya Danievskaya. And so she's talking about, in part, the changes that Marx makes to Chapter 1. And she wrote, in the first 2 editions in German, she writes, Marx had, quote, singled out the commodity form as the fetish, emphasizing the fantastic form of appearance of production relations as relations of things. In the French edition, by contrast, she writes she argues that Marx fully realized that the commodity must appear as a fetish in order to disguise the truth that at the point of production, what we really have is, quote, material relations between people. So from her perspective, that doesn't really, the fact of that relationship between the sort of abstract form of the commodity on the one hand and the material relations between people that sort of ground and define it on the other, doesn't come out so clearly until the French edition. And the other really important thing that Marx did in the course of writing that French edition is that he actually added this chapter. This chapter wasn't in the first German edition at all. And for Danievskaya, this change was also crucial to Marx's sort of reorientation towards human social relations. So she argues that she writes that Marx's earlier work, and she's here especially talking about the 1859 Critique of Political Economy, was remote, and that it applied dialectics rather than imagining the dialectic of history that emerges out of the workers' struggles themselves. And so she argues that the addition of the working day chapter suggests that Marx's mode of analysis itself had been revolutionized. And then she writes, Marx's shift from the history of theory to the history of production relations gives flesh and blood to the generalization that Marxism is the theoretical expression of the strivings of the proletariat. The addition of this chapter and the change in Marx's thinking that it marked, Danievskaya also reminds us, was not itself sort of sui generis or purely intellectual. It also had to do with historical changes. So it also has to do with a shift from the sort of profound political disappointment that followed the failure of the revolutions of 1848 and then there's a period of relative quiet in the workers' movement across the 1850s. And then in the late 1860s, you have the sort of resurgence of radical workers' movements across Europe. And those struggles, the particular demand of many of those struggles was precisely the shortening of the working day. One of the things that has become obvious to scholars is that Marx is responding, as he's writing this chapter and thinking about these changes to the volume, he's responding to the news he's receiving from friends and comrades about the Paris Commune. So he's not there, obviously he's still in Germany, but he's receiving all these letters and reports about what's going on in the Paris Commune, which is of course the short-lived People's Revolutionary Government that rules Paris for a brief 2 months in 1871, in the spring of 1871, May. So Kristen Ross has this beautiful, beautiful book called The Paris Commune, and she writes about the effect of the Commune on Marxist thought in terms that are similar to Danievskaya's. So again, you can see, like, I'm trying to sort of pull out like what Marxist feminists have gotten out of this chapter and try to have a sort of an archive and a citational, some citational history here that is feminist as opposed to just more Bowie's. So she writes, "The shock of the Commune's unfolding and the presence of so many of his friends in the fighting had an immediate effect on Marx, bringing him face to face with the present human forces of emancipation and demanding that he think alongside them." So she connects this directly to chapter 10 in particular, and she argues that for Marx, the mass extermination of tens of thousands of communards in the spring of 1871, which is effectively, right, like the effort on the part of the bourgeois Republican government to essentially eliminate its class enemy, was simply another version of the same class antagonism, what Marx calls in chapter 10 the Civil War, in fact, that was marking the long struggle over the length of the working day. So then she also writes, "To analyze this struggle, it was not enough to provide pathetic descriptions of monstrous labor conditions. Instead, in his chapter on the working day, Marx narrates the self-consciousness of the working class as revolutionary subject, thinking along with and beside the human forces newly pushing forth." And she quotes directly from this astonishing sentence from the 3rd page of the chapter. This is the sentence. It's a sentence that I love. It's one of the reasons why this is my favorite chapter. "Suddenly, however," so Marx is sort of saying, I'll read this whole passage, but the short bit is, "Suddenly, however, there arises the voice of the worker, which had previously been stifled in the sound and fury of the production process." So as that idea of voice, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a second, suggests, there were a lot of textual inspirations. We can already see Sound and Fury, right? That's from Macbeth. There are a lot of textual inspirations for Marx's added chapter on the working day. First were the reports that were also coming out of America, first by the abolitionists and then after the end of Civil War by freed slaves themselves, about the horror of slavery and what Marx calls in this chapter also the barter of human flesh. So that's one textual inspiration. And he here links to the struggle over slavery to the struggle of workers forced to work 18 hours a day, right? Even under conditions of sort of ostensible formal freedom. Another inspiration was very much Engels's book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, which has a similarly sort of like sociological kind of style. Engels' book, though, leaves off in the 1840s, and so as a result, the most sort of significant archival text for chapter 10 for Marx is the Blue Books. And the Blue Books were these reports produced by the governments of both England and Scotland on working conditions in the factories. So they would send inspectors in to inspect the factories, and this is sort of part of the movement towards regulating the length of the working day and also regulating the conditions of labor in the factories. So to write the 20 or so pages on the English factory legislation that he includes in this chapter, he went through a whole library of these reports. I mean, they're huge. It's a huge archive. And he considered these the most important documents available for the study of the capitalist mode of production. He thought they were really, really important. And so in the preface to Capital, the preface to this volume, he writes that he could not imagine finding men as competent, as free from partisanship as are the English factory inspectors. So, of course, it's in England. England is the sort of motherland of modern industry as Marx understands it, and thus it's also in England that this archive, which is, not only the Blue Books, but press and parliamentary debates, commissions of inquiry, official reports, etc. It's in England that this material is most available to provide sort of resources for Marx's synthesis. And so he also writes in the preface about the relative lack of government inquiry into working conditions in Germany, where he was writing this from. And he wrote, this is like a wonderful passage, Perseus wore a magic cap so that the monsters he hunted down might not see him. We draw the magic cap down over our own eyes and ears so as to deny that there are any monsters. So that's the way he describes the sort of the veiled ignorance, the intentional ignorance of people in Germany to the conditions of the factories that are like right amongst them, right? Since we're sort of on the theme of Marxist feminism, I'll also mention that Marx, who was known to be a fairly doting parent, had his daughters read the blue books to him and summarize bits of them for him. He had them take notes on them. His daughter Laura helped him at the reading room in the British Museum, which necessitated she had to lie about her age in order to qualify for a reader's ticket, so she had to say that she was older than she was. And Jenny did research for him at the Library of Bloomsbury, so he was very aided in his working through this archive by the work of his daughters. Besides asking his daughters to read the blue books, he also read with them a work of literature that was also very influenced by the blue books, which is Charles Dickens' 1856 novel Hard Times, which, if you've ever read it, I think it's like Dickens' best novel by far. It's a really amazing novel. And it treats the working conditions of factories in the industrial towns of Manchester and Preston in Britain with really shocking realist detail. Marx once wrote to Engels that the great Victorian novelists, especially Dickens and the Brontes, quote, have issued to the world more political and social truths that have been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists, and moralists put together. And I think you can really see the influence of the novelistic throughout this entire book, but I think you can particularly see it in the chapter on the working day. There's definitely a lot in the chapter that is about talking and is about voice. It might be said that the chapter is ethnographic in character insofar as there are lots of voices that sort of demand attention. So the bit that Ross quoted that I read a moment ago, the lines from Macbeth about sound and fury signifying nothing. We have here in this chapter, we hear the voice of the capitalist, we hear the voice of the inspectors themselves. At one point, an epidemic even talks, essentially. And so it seems as if in this chapter, as throughout the book, talking and the voice is really important to Marx. Remember that the conceit of that first chapter is, if commodities could talk, what would they say, right? And so in a way, one of the things that we might mark across the book is the shift from speaking commodities to this voice of the worker. So in that vein, I'm just going to read this amazing bit from the very beginning about where we sort of are first introduced to the voice of the worker. But what is a working day? At all events, it is less than a natural day. How much less? The capitalist has his own views of this point of no return, this necessary limit of the working day. As a capitalist, he is only capital personified. His soul is the soul of capital. But capital has one sole driving force, the drive to valorize itself, to create surplus value. Capital is dead labor, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. So there we have like that very familiar sort of Gothic mode that like reappears throughout Capital, and that like Jo will speak to tonight when she talks about horror film, Marxism and horror film. The time during which the worker works is the time during which the capitalist consumes the labor power he has brought from him. If the worker consumes his disposable time for himself, he robs the capitalist. The capitalist therefore takes his stand on the law of commodity exchange. Like other buyers, he seeks to extract the maximum possible benefit from the use value of the commodity. But suddenly, there arises the voice of the worker, which had previously been stifled in the sound and fury of the production process. And then this is in quotes, as if we have here the actual voice of the worker. The commodity I have sold you differs from the ordinary crowd of commodities in that its use creates value, a greater value than it costs. That is why you bought it. You and I know on the market only one law, that of the exchange of commodities. And then he goes on, blah, blah, blah. You are constantly preaching to me the gospel of saving and abstinence. Very well. Like a sensible, thrifty owner of property, I will husband my sole wealth, my labor power, and abstain from wasting it foolishly. Every day I will spend, set in motion, transfer into labor only as much of it as is compatible with its normal duration and healthy development. I therefore demand a working day of normal length, and I demand it without any appeal to your heart, for in money matters sentiment is out of place. You may be a model citizen, perhaps a member of the RSPCA, and you may be in the odor of sanctity as well, but the thing you represent when you come face to face with me has no heart in its breast. What seems to throb there is my own heartbeat. I demand a normal working day because, like every other seller, I demand the value of my commodity. And then, of course, it's interesting that we begin with the voice of the worker and then we end with the voice of the class. So I'll just read that passage. It must be acknowledged that our worker emerges from the process of production looking different than when he entered it. In the market, as owner of the commodity labor power, he stood face to face with other owners of commodity, one owner against another owner. So it's almost as if Marx here is actually narrating the passage of the chapter itself, where it begins with the individual speaking directly to the employer, the worker speaking directly to the employer. But when the transaction was concluded, it was discovered that he was no free agent, that for the period of time for which he is free to sell his labor power is the period of time for which he is forced to sell it, that in fact the vampire will not let go while there remains a single muscle, sinew, or drop of blood to be exploited. For protection against the serpent of their agonies, the workers have to put their heads together and, as a class, compel the passing of a law, an all-powerful social barrier by which they can be prevented from selling themselves and their families into slavery and death by voluntary contract with capital. In the place of the pompous catalog of the inalienable rights of man, there steps the modest Magna Carta of the legally limited working day, which at last makes clear when the time which the worker sells is ended and when his own begins. And then it ends with a quotation from the Aeneid, quantum mutatis ab illio, what a great change from that time. So it begins with the voice of the worker speaking to the capitalist directly as the buyer of the worker's labor power. It ends with this sort of imagination of a collective voice of the class as a whole. In between those two sections, of course, Marx works through a number of arguments about the specific role that the management of the working day, and specifically working time, because time is very much the content of this chapter, plays in Capital. So he opens by arguing, quote, the working day is not a constant but a variable quantity. One of its parts is determined by the labor time required for the reproduction of the labor power of the worker himself, but its total amount varies with the duration of surplus labor. So it's worth sort of seeing what Marx is saying there. One of the important themes of the chapter is the idea of the variability of the working day, right? So Marx says that one thing that variably divides the working day is the difference between the time required for the reproduction of the worker itself and the duration of surplus labor. So what he's saying here basically is that the worker has to fulfill two demands over the course of the day. The first is that he must produce enough value to repay the capitalist for what the capitalist has spent on wages, and the wages themselves are determined by what it costs to reproduce them, his means of subsistence, right? So that's the first part of what he has to sort of restore. The value that he has to restore is the amount of wages, and the wages again are determined by what it costs for him to reproduce himself. It's really worth noting that this idea of subsistence is not, for Marx, and I think this sometimes gets sort of misunderstood, it's not like a caloric measure. It's not natural. In fact, it's often quite culturally specific. So he says in this chapter, the worker needs time in which to satisfy his intellectual and social requirements, and the extent and number of these requirements is conditioned by the general level of civilization. The length of the working day thus fluctuates within boundaries both physical and social. So again, it's not natural, this idea of means of subsistence. It's culturally determined. And in fact, elsewhere, Marx has a joke that's beer is crucial to the reproduction of the German worker and wine is crucial to the reproduction of the French worker, right? So that's an example of how, in Seattle it would be like coffee, right? Workers in all different places have different goods and the sort of basket of goods that is necessary for their reproduction. And also different kinds of employment, right? So that this is a way, when people are always I don't know, how do you talk about, why somebody with a PhD might earn more than somebody with a high school degree, right? You can say well, you have to compensate the worker for the time spent and the money spent in gaining the education necessary to have the job, right? That's how you explain those kinds of wage differentials. After that, though, the worker has to produce another form of value, namely surplus value. This is a portion of his work that is basically unpaid and whose value accrues instead to the capitalist. So in the next chapter, Marx will explain that there's two ways of getting surplus value. The first, and it's first historically but also first conceptually, is just to force the worker to work really long hours, or in some cases even to pay the worker less than his cost of subsistence. So he calls this absolute surplus value extraction, which is basically surplus value achieved over the domination of time or wages, one of those two things, or both. the argument of the working day chapter as a whole is that, and this is like one of the things I think is most interesting about it, is that there's like this fascinating contradiction embedded in this idea of absolute surplus value extraction, which is that the capitalist wants to wring as much value as humanly possible from the labor he's bought, but he cannot destroy the worker in the process, right? Because the worker is the only thing that produces surplus value for him. So he wants to like push the worker to his absolute physical limits, his bodily limits, right? He wants to reduce the wage to as close to or even below the rate of subsistence of the worker, but he can't kill the worker.
But isn't it, there's always a surplus of workers, it wouldn't matter if they killed.
Yes, that's right. And he begins to talk about surplus populations towards the end of this chapter. Yes, absolutely. So those are the conditions where absolute value extraction by pushing down the wage below the rate of subsistence is like totally possible. But there's just some situations where like it's not valuable for the capitalist to do that. He just has to keep the workers sort of barely alive. But no, that's totally a good question. That's one of the functions that population plays, right? The reserve army of the unemployed, he calls them. So the worker, meanwhile, of course, is driven by a related contradiction, which is that he wants to be paid as much as possible, but the fact that there are other workers for sale, others who might do the work, compels him to accept lower wages. So in a way, there's like two forms of competition. The capitalist has to respond to competition by trying to wring as much surplus value as possible without killing the only source of that surplus value. The worker, meanwhile, has to respond to the competition of other workers by accepting as low a wage as possible as he can and continue to reproduce himself without destroying himself in the process. So much as the capitalist is compelled to preserve the worker's capacity to work, the fact of competition compels the worker to ensure she doesn't fall down on the job. So among other things, the worker might be compelled to stay fit, get sleep, don't be drunk all the time, basically not go crazy, right? That all of these forms of sort of like self-regulation that the worker has to perform in order to keep herself sort of existing in a system where she's depending on her labor for her means of subsistence. So as a result of the sort of contradictions that are embedded in this idea of absolute surplus value extraction, in the next section of the book, Marx sort of says that capital turns more and more to the second way to get surplus value from the worker via relative, as opposed to absolute relative surplus value extraction, which is increasing the worker's productivity so that it takes the worker less time to reproduce that first part of the value that he has to produce, right, the wage part, and so that more of the day is actually the surplus value, right? So Marx even talks about this like that it would be as if you could divide the day into hours, right, that the first 4 hours the worker reproduces himself, and then the next 10 hours he reproduces surplus value for the capitalist. But Marx also says, like, don't think that you could actually look at the working process and see the difference between those two kinds of work, right? It looks like one sort of continuous whole, and in fact, it's only by way of this kind of analysis that you can see that it's actually divided into these two parts. And of course, relative surplus value extraction also creates a contradiction that Marx will go into towards the end of the book. In fact, the contradiction embedded in relative surplus value will become the basis for Marx's theory of the crisis, which is essentially that the best way to increase productivity is to have more and more machines doing more and more of the work. But of course, that poses a problem because machines don't produce surplus value, only workers do. Back to chapter 10, we did also note that one of the things that Marx does not talk about here, which is the way that the reproduction of labor power works. And a lot of the most interesting Marxist feminist scholarship, particularly beginning in the 1970s, with scholars like Silvia Federici, Maria Osta della Costa, Leopoldo Fortunati, Selma James, etc., has been about insisting that we attend to the ways in which the male worker's reproduction, both in Marx's model and in Capital itself, the male worker's reproduction depends on the unpaid but necessary domestic work of women. That essentially that if women didn't do the cooking and cleaning and child caring for free, it would cost a lot more for the male worker to reproduce himself and his family, so that the women's work is necessary not only to her husband, but also to capital itself, right? And so that if maybe not sort of productive of surplus value itself, it is absolutely necessary to the circuit of the reproduction of surplus value. So Marx doesn't really talk about that here. One of the reasons he doesn't is that the period that he's talking about, and precisely the moment he's talking about, is a period in which women themselves, of the working classes, women themselves were working in factories. So they weren't actually at home helping to reproduce the male worker. They were also working in the factories too. But it's still worth noting, and it's also worth noting that much as Marx's edition of this chapter was driven by these reports he's receiving from on the ground in the Paris Commune, that the work of those Marxist feminists in the 70s is driven by their own activism, particularly the Wages for Housework movement and the sort of socialist women's movement of that period. So sort of part of the theme here again is the relationship between activism and theory, or theory and praxis. So Marx is really clear here that the battle between the worker and capitalist over the length of the working day and its division into wages and surplus value isn't technical, it's also historical and political. So he says that the capitalist who has the right of the purchaser and the worker who has the right of the seller, quote, equally bear the seal of the law of exchange. Between equal rights, force decides. I think that's like a super important sentence. Hence, in the history of capitalist production, the establishment of a norm for the working day presents itself as a struggle over the limits of that day, a struggle between collective capital, the class of the capitalists, and collective labor, the working class. So that between equal rights, force decides bit, I think is really interesting because sometimes, it seems to me in the last number of decades in critical theory, there's been this sense that there's like this sort of clear and fast distinction between theories of exploitation on the one hand and theories of domination on the other hand, and theories of exploitation would be the Marxists and the theories of domination would be the Foucauldians or post-colonialists, etc., right? And it seems to me that it's chapters like this that you can actually see that for Marx, they are always already the same thing. It becomes very clear in the chapter on primitive accumulation, but it's also clear here, between equal rights, force decides, right? He's basically saying that like this gets fought, first it gets fought in the streets, it gets fought in places like the Paris Commune, and then second it gets fought in the courts and in the legislative process when they try to put in place these regulations, right? So the next bit of the chapter, and I think it's coming directly from that idea of force decides, then works through that sort of history a bit from slave labor. He talks about slave labor. He talks about unpaid serf labor in the corvées. He talks about peasant labor and then ultimately factory work. So he does this very quick little sort of history. He discusses the various factory acts of the mid-19th century and describes them, he compares them, this is like also another great passage, he compares them to, quote, the manuring of the English fields with guano being bird shit, basically, right? And so he's basically saying that much as the land had been drained, the soil had been drained of vitality from the sort of ceaseless greed of capitalist agriculture, that the workers were at risk of being drained of their productive power. And the implication there, it's fairly clear, is that the factory acts themselves and limits to the working day that are imposed legislatively are not instituted over moral feeling, but in order to put a check on capital lest it destroy itself, right? That left unchecked, left unregulated, capital would essentially drain everything from the workers in exactly the same way they had drained everything from the soil. And it's actually super interesting, that connection between like workers and soil is so crucial to classical political economy throughout this period. It's one of those moments where you can see the influence, even if it's a sort of vexed influence of Malthus and Smith on Marx, for whom that sort of organic conception is also really crucial. Marx is much more critical about it and much more thoughtful about it and its historicity than either Malthus or Smith, but you can still sort of see that organicism of a certain strain of classical political economy. I'm always deeply like, it's always worth like being, sort of skeptical of like these kind of organic substance theories of value, but if you spend a lot of time in like microeconomics classes and it's like this sort of purely subjective psychological theory of value, like you come to really appreciate all those references to bird shit, basically. Marx doesn't say at this point, obviously, because there's no sort of, regnant discourse of ecological catastrophe, but I actually think also in that image of the soil being drained, you can see a sort of connection between a Marxist theory of crisis and an ecological theory of crisis. And so then later in the chapter, he says that the establishment of the normal working day is the result of centuries of struggle, the capitalist struggle to extend it, the workers to shorten it, and again, he calls this sort of civil war, which is a term that Kristen Ross in the Paris Commune book sort of picks up on and says, like, this is where you can see the influence of the communes on his thought in this chapter, is the repeated comparison of the struggle over the working day to a civil war between these two classes. So that's sort of my like introductory ideas. There's different sort of passages and questions that we could talk about. Maybe one that I'll just like sort of open up is that He has this great bit in here on the bread industry and on baking, and that is also related to the Paris Commune because one of the first demands of the communards when they set up their sort of first set of demands that are going to structure their government has to do with bakeries. This is again one of those like culturally specific means of subsistence. The French immediately go to bread, right, in bakeries. It had to do with like restricting the amount of time that the bakers would have to work, and also trying to prevent adulteration of bread, and also prevent prices from going up. So he has this great thing on the bread factories. And then, almost as if acknowledging the chapter's debt to narratives like Dickens, he goes on to introduce what are two essentially literary characters that are going to structure the middle part of the analysis. And he said their striking contrast proves that all men are alike in the face of capital, a milliner and a blacksmith. So he has these two figures of the milliner and blacksmith, and he's basically like, the milliner is there to say, you think that there's this kind of labor that's done by women, that's very clean, right? That's very like, we have a sort of sentimental sense of it, that it's like, that it's not sort of hyper exploitative. And in fact, he goes on to tell these stories of milliners basically like dying on the job because they're overworked. And then he says the blacksmith, and we think of the blacksmith as this like sort of hale and hearty figure of like masculine power and also kind of natural kind of work, right, that goes back into history. And in fact, these blacksmiths are basically like also dying because of the damage to their bodies. So he has these two sort of representative figures for the capitalism of his period. And I was sort of thinking like, who would the like representative figures of like 21st century capitalism be? Like if we were trying to describe like, the working day, like the working day today, like what kind of jobs would we like turn to? Tech workers? Yeah, like how so?
The stereotype.
Yeah.
Of, like how it's easy and white collar.
Yeah.
Like, the long hours and the attachment, the 24-hour access to the worker.
Totally. Like having your email on all the time, basically, right? Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
There is that new book that came out by Corey Pine called Live, Work, Die, about the Silicon Valley.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Yeah, the stories about like the Amazon workers, like even the desk workers are just like, fucking horrifying. Yeah, what were you gonna say? Teachers, yeah, right. Yeah, totally. I hadn't even thought about that. I was sort of thinking more in the like tech work, service work thing, but yeah, like you mean because of unionization right now?
Well, also because of the romanticization of that,
Yeah.
and it is also residual labor, right? I mean, blacksmith is residual labor for Marx.
Right, that's right.
He thinks, right, the hegemonic horizon is factory labor,
Yeah.
which is going to do entirely with the blacksmith, right?
Right.
So I think that there's a certain...
You mean they're residual because they're like, capital would very much like to automate them out of existence?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like that's true of teachers.
Yeah, totally.
Well, you were talking about self-regulation. You know how it all started because they were forced to wear Fitbits, or they were threatened.
Yeah.
I didn't know that at all.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
In order to get low wages on their health care.
There were healthcare costs.
Yes, that was like the final straw.
That's an amazing example.
And that seems to be a trend.
To wear Fitbits to monitor that they're walking and exercising, and that even though they're probably working.
And Amazon had developed this thing for warehouse workers, which I call the electronic overseer, which is something that they had to wear to track where they were every minute. It seems to be a trend going in this direction.
Oh my God. Yeah, we're
Another adding on to that, a story recently, my really friend was a Lyft driver and worked so hard to get all these targets and bonuses for the week and everything, and the next week everything changed. Like, and they've been driving for like 2 years, and the next week that they meet all these levels, they increased the number of like rides they get to get, they changed the hours so that he had to drive like till 3 in the morning, and the whole game changed because he had like met this like magical bonus, like beginning like level.
right. Yeah, gamification, right?
Yeah.
So wait, like once he got to that point, then it changed? Like
Yes, they
just they do it for
10
like,
times harder to get the bonus in the future.
Oh
oh my God.
It's like the equivalent of surge pricing, surge hours.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the talk I'm giving tonight is basically about like, sort of about TV, but it's also about like gig work, particularly driving gig work. And it seems to me that like gig work is like such a perfect example for this. Like also like TaskRabbit, I think is like.
Or Fiverr, remember that?
No, it's that one.
All tasks are $5.
Yeah, the last time sorry, go ahead. Dan.
I haven't really looked into it, but I've heard of it. Yeah, it seems like everybody, it's whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, just the last one. That's it.
No, go ahead.
It's anecdotal. The last time I took a Lyft, the driver had to make 17 rides that day in order to not have to pay for the car that he was renting from Lyft.
Yes, I've been reading about this, like basically like subprime car rental services that they've instituted. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to sort of these examples also kind of push back against this chapter as well, since the temporal measure, right?
That's
We're in a
right,
period
right.
where relative surplus value is almost, it's intensifying, and
Right.
yet it's also decoupling from, right?
From time.
Right, because there is, how do we even sort of think our work time now at a point where,
Yeah.
and yet, I mean, I think like one of the frustrations I have with a lot of contemporary Marxists is the move away from thinking about labor time at all, right?
Yeah.
And the labor theory of value, right? There's
Right.
this sort of in vogue thing to say, well, that's not really that important anymore. We're
That's
interested in
right.
finance and arbitrage and
Yeah.
this, but it remains the measure at the same time, which is the part of the contradictions, right? That you're still paid an hourly wage even if you're expected to work far beyond that wage. So it's I think it's a really important point of struggle.
Yeah.
Like with the Fiverr, I think, or any of these, right? They set the so-called platform provider sets a temporal limit, right? You have to make your delivery, you have to make your drop off in a
Right.
prescribed time, which is how they do their pricing models.
Right.
So
No, that's a really good point, because it's also, I mean, in a way, like, I mean, you were talking a second ago about like residual, in a way there's almost something residual about it too, though, because it's piecework, right? Like the model, the TaskRabbit model really seems to be piecework, right? And the speed with which you can accomplish like your rate, right? Your piecework rate, essentially. Yeah.
Well, in the not too distant future, there won't be any Lyft and Uber drivers, there'll be driverless cars. The other thing is that one way that companies like Walmart are able to pay below subsistence wage is that the workers there have to go on welfare.
Yeah.
And so it's our tax dollars that are paying the salaries of the workers at Walmart and other corporations that the richest, the Walmart family, the richest people in the world, don't have to pay the salaries
Yeah.
even.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, it's amazing those like the way those contradictions play out. The thing about like the automation is like really interesting too, because apparently I've read that like if you look at the services that are like Mechanical Turk or TaskRabbit, the ones that are about online work in particular, things like going through photographs and identifying and tagging photographs, that a lot of the service requests that are being sent out to workers through those platforms are actually sent out by the platform itself. And it's basically trying to train the natural language processing, artificial intelligence of the service so that eventually these things can be done without workers at all. So essentially like in like this highly literal way, workers are like producing the conditions of their own ultimate like obsolescence. Exactly. Yeah, it's quite uncanny.
And also the concept that Marx talks about, that the wage, which we refer to, is really socially determined through class struggle, whereas other commodities, it isn't, other than the commodities that involve the subsistence of the wage. Other commodities are determined by, let's say, like for Marx, the values, not through class struggle.
That's right, yeah. And I mean, that's like also super interesting to think about. I mean, one of the things I'm talking about tonight is like, you know, the way that gig work and service work and tip work look more like what Marx calls the Lumpenproletariat than like what he calls the proletariat. And probably like part of what's going on is that there's no, like it's difficult to impossible to have a collective workers movement around these types of employment. And so it becomes very hard for workers to have, for there to be any kind of like united force of the workers to like make any changes in these wage conditions. I mean, Uber and Lyft, like they're working towards that, but it seems like it's going to be hard. Chris?
Oh, I think I was just going to say that there's something truly poetic about Fiverr in particular, just because the $5 working day was
That's right, yeah.
Ford's great invention to
That's
kind of
right.
mold the character of industrial working class.
Absolutely, yeah. It's also like, that's also super interesting in terms of like the relationship between all that stuff and Silicon Valley's enthusiasm for universal basic income,
Yeah.
right? Which is that essentially, I mean, that's like a version, it seems to me, of the Walmart workers being on welfare, right? Is that like, of course, Silicon Valley is enthusiastic about universal basic income because they're not paying people enough to make a living. The point of the $5 day was that you should eventually be able to afford to buy one of the cars you were making, right? But that's not going to be the case when people are working through these platforms where they're making like not even anything approximating a living wage. So then you have to supplement that with something like UBI or welfare or whatever, right? Otherwise, the working class can't reproduce itself. Yeah.
Well, it also like I think really from this point on that there's this drive in the book that's I kind of think not actually realized, which is the question of the state and its relation to capital, because right, this is kind of what we're talking about, right? Where is the state? Will it step in? In this case, if it was setting the working day through the Factory Acts. Now it becomes UBI or not. I mean, that's
right.
another aspect of how do we think of the state as a terrain of struggle in relation to and sort of.
And he even says in here, right, that like it's not like, you know, contrary maybe to a certain kind of account where like, you know, like sort of embodied domination becomes abstract domination. He actually says like it's not a straight line towards factory reform, right? In fact, you have like competing acts going through the legislature all the time in this period where factory owners want to lengthen the working day, right? And workers want to shorten it. So it's not as if like it's so obvious that the state always steps in on behalf of the population, right? On behalf of the citizens.
Or even, right? Like,
That's right, exactly. Yeah.
So, I didn't remember how Marx complimented the factory inspectors and stuff, which is interesting because the conventional wisdom now about regulations that can't be done is always co-opted. All that public choice theory bullshit is just basically seeped in, so everybody thinks this is up. But here is Marx, you know, who wants to go beyond liberalism, or not liberalism, but any kind of political system that existed there, saying, but at least, you know, you can have some sort of independent regulation. What I wanted to say was I'm also struck by starting with this chapter, like you do. I mean, I think Carl Korsch or someone wrote a thing for one edition doing it, and it seems so logical because there's a point where everybody understands and gets it. People are still struggling over their hours, their bathroom breaks, and so forth. And it seems to me that it's crying, Molly Mack, where are you? For an exhibit called The Working Day, which is interactive, which is built around people leaving testimony about their working day and kind of relating it to see exactly what of these factors that Marx talked about is still around and how things that he predicted didn't happen, like the real subsumption of everything under capital instead of outsourcing and so forth. But you know, the other thing, when I read about the truckers, trying to reduce the hours of the truckers, because most of the accidents happen in hours between the 10th hour and the 12th hour. You know, and yet the unions, truckers are resisting it being pushed down and compelling because they needed to make all the money to live in you know. I remember all those things in that chapter where he's talking about these railway workers who are on trial, where the engineers who got into crashes, they got into crashes because they were being worked, you know, like 40 hours, you know. So plus argent, plus minimum, right?
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. I think that point about that argument about regulation is a really good one. It's one of the things that like it's a fascinating chapter because I mean I think Kristen Ross is right to like locate this as a like profoundly like revolutionary chapter, right? To locate in this chapter the importance of that term civil war, but it's also clear that there is a part of this chapter that's just fairly straightforward, like 19th century liberal pro-regulation, right? I mean, I think the way that he tries to nuance that is again by that argument that like, in fact, like the regulation is the state's way of stepping in and saving capitalism from itself, right? And those moments when the state has to step in and sort of like regulate capitalist competition in order to keep it from just like burning itself completely out, like that does, you know, that clearly that happens.
Well, there's the factor, they mentioned the army, and the fact that when there was some statistic like 70% of British workers who were drafted in World War I couldn't qualify because physically they were so destroyed. And when you need large armies to wage wars like you did up to World War I, and as opposed to you're doing them by drone and electronics, you don't need to keep them as healthy now.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of like the way that Marx also compares this system to slavery, right? He sort of says like, the slave owner is responsible for the means of subsistence of the slaves and for making sure that they don't die, right? And that this is essentially, that it's equivalent to slavery, not even in the extent of the working day, but in the sort of problem of how do you work a body so much that you get as much as you can out of it without killing it at the same time.
It also seems like the variability of subsistence becomes really important here. I guess sort of in thinking of it in our contemporary moment, because it seems as though part of the technology that Marx understood but didn't understand at the same time, which now I'm going to go back on what I said earlier, but the debt, the way debt functions here in our, which is so tied to sort of the capacities that computational technologies allow us to have, which allows for this sort of pushing that, this intensification of work where, right, if it's not the state that's going to step in, it's going to be Wells Fargo instead.
That's right. Yeah.
Will
I mean,
be alive. So
it has
long
seemed
as
to be like fairly clear that there's like this sort of remarkable thing that starts happening, really in the 1980s, which is that like there's two desperate needs on the part of sort of increasingly failing capital, and one is for a place for capitalists to invest because production is not producing the profits that it once did, and the other is wage stagnation, which is either going to lead to a sort of a political crisis or a sort of structural one, right, where workers can't buy anything. And then amazingly, these two things get solved by the same mechanism, which is credit, right? And so on the one hand, you have credit becomes securitized so that you give the capitalist class this immense financial sector in which to invest. And on the other hand, you essentially create a compensatory wage that is like credit card debt, right? And asset equity in terms of houses for those that own houses, right? It just seems like so obvious that and in fact, like, fairly now, it's like fairly mainstream argument, not among economists per se, but at least among economic historians. I mean, Elizabeth Warren's like academic work before she was a politician, like this is basically exactly her argument, is that like this is why credit emerges, consumer credit emerges in the 1980s in the way that it does, is to compensate for what was by then like a decade and a half of wage stagnation and what, by the early 2000s had been 3 decades of wage stagnation.
I think the technology is a key part of that as well, because it's part of what enables that recognition of the potential of debt and its ability to quickly continually sort of adjust
That's right,
in relation to multiple things. And it's then tied into questions around automation generally.
Yeah.
It's sort of computer as steam engine in a certain sense.
Yeah, one of the things I read about in my book is that that there's this argument by sort of people that work in like that sort of social science or finance type stuff. It's a fairly persuasive argument, which is that like you have a shift from a model where people are either credit worthy or not credit worthy, like it's an absolute binary, and that moves basically through computation and algorithmic computation and also the ability to collect more and more data. You move from a binary to a spectrum, right? And so it's not do you get credit or not, it's how much will it cost you, right? So that's where you have the emergence of like of subprime comes out of the desire to find like a new population to sell credit to or sell debt to essentially, and that you can then sort of price the risk in a highly precise way rather than just saying it's like a yes or a no. And that's like, the story of like how that happens and the way that it's tied to like the Fair Credit Act of the 1970s, which is meant to prevent against, because like there's a period, right, where if you're like black or brown or female or old, like you're just not going to get a period, right? And so you have the Equal Credit Opportunity Act that passes in the 1970s, and that seems like a great liberal reform, but surprise, surprise, it precisely enables capitalism to be like, oh, interesting, there are all these people that we haven't given credit to. I wonder how much we could charge them. So one of those moments where like what seems to be like reform ultimately ends up being like, a sort of highly capturable moment, right? Yeah.
But there's also the level in which they're not going by, the likely, how much, we'll have to charge them more because they're less likely to pay us back it was a whole scam, as we all know. I mean, in terms of people going out, selling mortgages to people, and then aggregating, selling mortgages to another company like Goldman Sachs is going to aggregate them. So they don't even handle the mortgage. They didn't care.
Right, that's right, yeah.
The mortgage was, if it was going to work or not, because they just sold it.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing about it is that, like, the first part of the movement is totally towards data, right? And then by the end of it, they've run out of people that they can sort of price in a way that they think is safe. And then they're like, we don't want any information from you, right? That's where you get the ninja, the no, you have no job, no asset loan, right? Where it's like actually, instead of finding out everything about you, we would really prefer to know nothing about you so that we can justify giving you this mortgage, right? Where they actually tell people like, no, don't give us pay stubs. We'll just like leave that part blank because they actually don't even want on record how little the family that they're giving this mortgage to makes. So yeah, that's totally right. But that's by the point that they're desperate because they've already sold mortgages to everybody that they think is a even remotely plausible credit risk.
But the other thing about the state is that the state is usually pictured as, as you pointed out, the institution that's going to come in and say, okay, capital, you've gone beyond the pale here.
Gone too far. Yeah.
We're going to destroy the population.
Right.
We need to. But since 1980, they don't seem to be doing that anymore. The normal function of the state to moderate it doesn't seem to be happening. Even after the 2007-8 crisis, there hasn't been any reform that's really going to stop all of the things that they have done. I mean, they can continue to do them. So it's odd that the state doesn't seem to care that, I mean, there's a surplus population, they put them in jail, et cetera, they do things like that, but there's no real concern anymore that there are people on welfare, that this very wealthy city is full of homeless people.
Well, the state's not a person. It's not something that used to act one way and act another. We have to look at who's going in to be part of the state now.
Right.
I mean, it's funny when you look at Trump's cabinet, you can look at what I mean, I'm not trying to reduce this down to conspiracy or so forth, but the number of people who see finance and the state, the interest is identical, is different than it was in the 19th century when people had, let's say, national honor or whatever it was that was driving state people to get into wars at particular things. So one would have to look at the composition of who's part of it to see whether the state itself has shifted.
Right. Well, I think it also, I mean, what has most clearly shifted are the needs of capital itself, right? Like if once capital required that the state step in and protect workers from capital's own competitive aims, now capital doesn't seem to require workers at all. And in fact, it would prefer that the state, do whatever minimal thing it wants to do, but it doesn't, there's nothing to preserve, right?
But
At least
the workers are disorganized, they don't threaten as they did in the 1930s. There's not the threat there.
Right. I mean, they're also working in very different parts of parts of capital, right? I mean, 75% of the people employed today are in some sector of the service economy, right? And that's a big category that includes lots of things that we don't typically think of, but that creates a very different kind of working class and a very different kind of structural relationship between work and between the capitalist class and the state. Yeah.
Do you ascribe to this notion that the state is, their hands are tied because of the falling rate of profit?
Yes, I do, basically, yeah. No, I mean, I think that's the other thing, is that the social surpluses that might have once funded those kinds of robust social welfare programs, and not because the state in the mid-century was any more benevolent. I mean, I don't think that's true either, right? I mean, one of the things that I do work on, sort of critical university studies and the university, and one of the things I talk about is that, the buildup of the public university system, the creation of the University of California system, for instance, was born entirely out of anxieties in the wake of the war that the U.S. did not have a sufficiently educated population, and that there was going to be an unemployment crisis. They're sort of looking at all of these men returning, and they're like, where the fuck are they going to work, right? And so the GI Bill and the sort of creation of the public university system that people are very nostalgic about today comes entirely out of very early human capital theory. Before Gary Becker and the sort of so-called neoliberals, Theodore Schultz, Clark Kerr, the founder of the UC system, was reading Theodore Schultz, human capital theorist, in the 1940s and 50s, and used that idea of like future employment to build a public university system, because they needed it, right? Because capitalism needed it, and doesn't need it anymore because it doesn't need workers. And so I think like instead of like thinking of that period as a period where you had this state that was sort of separate from the demands of capital, and that now somehow the university and the state have been sort of co-opted or captured by capital, I think it's better to see it as like simply changing needs. Yeah, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to add that it's shifted from that notion of human capital to debt,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, that's right.
Now the university is just a debt machine.
That's right, and one of the differences between these early human capital theorists like Frank Knight and Theodore Schultz and their students like Gary Becker and the sort of liberals is that Schultz actually did think that the state had sufficient pecuniary interest in having an educated workforce that it should pay for the education. And by the time you get to Becker, it's more of like this is an investment in the worker's own sort of entrepreneurial future. So that definitely shifts, yeah, for sure. But one of the things I read about is how like, we had this sense that like, back in the day, like nobody cared about whether or not you could get a job, and thus it was like fine to major in English, right? And like now you're like required to be an engineer because we now somehow instrumentalize education that didn't used to, right? But it seems obvious that like, in fact, what happened, in the 50s and 60s is that as you have like the education premium, which is the amount of extra money that you earn because you have a degree, the education premium climbs. You could major in English and have a perfectly good upper middle class life later on, right? Like there was no need to differentiate precisely because employment was basically guaranteed with a college degree in that period, right? And so it's not that it was like not instrumentalized then and it is now, it's just that the instruments have changed. Yes.
We also have to put in Sputnik as another driver of building public education, and the competition. The absence of the USR has been catastrophic for any working class here. Any concessions of any kind to it. Well, I think we should, this is wonderful.
Yeah.